Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program in our virtual theater, The Forgotten Singer, which is presented, as part of the Yiddish Book Center's Great Jewish Book Club. Before we get started, a few things to note. Your video and audio will be turned off throughout the program. You may submit questions through the question panel at the bottom right of your screen, and we ask that you refrain from comments and keep questions short so that we can get to all of them this evening. It's a great treat to introduce this evening's guests, presenters. Ezra Glinter is the senior staff writer and editor at the Yiddish Book Center. Ezra is an award-winning writer, editor, translator, and biographer, born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He attended McGill University and New York University, where he received a master's degree from the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute in 2011. For 5 years, Ezra worked as the deputy culture editor of the Forward newspaper, where he edited Have I Got a Story for You, a landmark anthology of Yiddish fiction in translation. In addition to the Forward, Ezra's writing has appeared in the New Republic, the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, the Paris Review, the Walrus Magazine, and the National Post, among other publications. Max Weinreich is a postdoctoral researcher in mathematics at Harvard University. He comes to Yiddish through his family ties to the language. His great-grandfather, also named Max Weinreich, founded the field of Yiddish sociological linguistics and was one of the 3 co-founders of YIVO. His grandfather, Uriel Weinreich, was a renowned Yiddish linguist in his own right. Drawn to Yiddish by a budding curiosity about his family's history, our guest Max was a student at the Yiddish Book Center Steiner Summer Yiddish program in 2016, where he worked on indexing poetry recordings and has been a steward of the Yiddish Book Center's Great Jewish Books Club since its inception. As a book club steward, he leads discussions and conversations about both classic Jewish books and new translations. Welcome, Ezra, and welcome, Max. Lovely to have you here tonight. And as we agreed, we're going to format this evening's program a bit differently than billed in our program event listing for all of you. The 3 of us got together on a Zoom call the other day and decided, let's try to do something a little different and make this evening a part panel discussion, part conversation, and of course, we'll take questions from all of you in the audience, many of whom have read this evening's featured book club selection, The Forgotten Singer, a memoir by Maurice Carr. I thought I would introduce a little bit of background for those of you not familiar with the book, which is set in the interwar period. Maurice Carr, son of Esther Kreitman, paints a harrowing portrait of a fractured family and very fragile family. His father disappears fighting in Russia. His mother suffers from epileptic seizures, a lifelong affliction. As the family bounces around from refugee hotels while the bombs are still falling to attics, flats, and houses in London. Esther pawns clothing and jewelry to pay the rent, and Maurice faces anti-Semitism and disillusionment as he grapples with the burden of being the adult in the family while still in grade school. And a bit about Esther Kreitman before we launch into conversation. I'm going to take the liberty of borrowing from Faith Jones' post about Kreitman, which appears on the Jewish Women's Archives. For a little bit of background, Esther Kreitman was the only female writer in one of the most prominent families in Yiddish literature. She was born in Poland in 1891. As a child, she learned several languages and became interested in world literature, despite her parents' refusal to provide her with a formal education. After the disintegration of her marriage in 1926, she moved to England and supported herself through writing, traveling, and speaking. Through her literary work, which has often been overshadowed by her brothers I.B. and I.J. Singer, Kreitman went on to produce notable contributions to the genre of Yiddish literature in her novels and short stories. Her stories and serialized novels appeared in Yiddish newspapers worldwide before being published in book form. 3 books published in Yiddish in her lifetime: the novels The Devil Does Dance, 1936, Diamonds, 1944, collection of stories, Lineage, 1949. In addition to writing her own fiction, Kreitman translated Dickens and Shaw into Yiddish and was active not only in maintaining the London literary journal Loschen and Lieben, but also in socialist circles. She died on June 13th, 1954, in her apartment in London. In Bashevis' story, Yenta the Yeshiva Boy, it said that it's based on Kreitman in part, on his sister's thwarted desire for education. Feminist critics see it as a literary appropriation curiously devoid of empathy, especially given Bashevis' lack of real-life aid to Kreitman's literary or personal ambitions. Her son, Maurice Carr, translated Deborah, her novel, from Yiddish into English, and her short story, The Relic. Max, I thought I'd toss the proverbial mic to you to get us started. As the moderator of the Yiddish Book Club's Facebook forum, I thought you might start the conversation by posing some questions to open up this conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. So yeah, I thought maybe one thing to just start off by talking about would be where this book that we've read is fitting into the broader landscape of Yiddish literature and Jewish literature now. So why is it interesting to have a book like this coming out now? So Ezra, I know that you edited our first book of the year, so you have some experience with the sort of broader world of Yiddish and Jewish publishing that most of us would lack. So sort of like what's going on in Jewish publishing now that makes a book like this interesting?
I'm not sure that I can answer the whole question of what's going on in Jewish publishing now, but I think that from the perspective of the Yiddish Book Center and of the books, the center's imprint, White Coat Press, which of course Lisa can also speak to. This is a little bit less usual than I think what we normally publish, which is predominantly works of Yiddish literature and translation. This is, although it has a lot to do with Yiddish literature, it is not in translation. It's originally written in English. It has appeared previously, I believe, in French. It was published by Carr's daughter, Hazel Carr, who's lives in Paris. But now it's appearing in its original version in English for the first time. So it's a little bit out of the usual for what we do, but obviously it's seems appropriate. It has everything to do with Yiddish literature, with Yiddish literature's most famous names, obviously. And I think, like any memoir, also it's of interest for different reasons, on several levels. There is, of course, the subject matter, the headline of the book, which is that it's about Esther Kreitman, it's about the forgotten singer's sister, it's about the singer family, all these subjects which are of great interest to readers of Yiddish literature. But it also works, it's also a merit on its own right. It's a memoir. It's a memoir about the author. It's about his own experiences as a child. It's a work of literature on its own, and not just a work about other literature. But it is both things, and I think that it makes it of particular interest to us and hopefully to its readers.
Lisa, you were part of bringing the book to publication, right? You met with Hazel Carr and worked on the White Goat Press side of it.
Certainly worked on the White Goat Press side of it. Didn't meet with her directly, but Hazel submitted this for consideration to White Goat, and we did consider it. And as Ezra mentioned, it was never published in the original, which is, he wrote it in English. So it's a bit of a departure, but it was something I think we felt strongly about for all of the reasons that Ezra just articulated very well. It's interesting as a memoir in its own right. It's really a nicely written piece. Carr was a journalist. He was a writer as well. it gives us insight into a Jewish experience, and also, interestingly, into a family that had a great literary lineage. And also the relationship between a son and a mother, and Kreitman in her own right, who was a notable writer.
It seems to me that there's also been an uptick in interest in Yiddish women writers in particular. Last year, there was an article in the New York Times even about all the Yiddish women who'd been published through partly the White Goat Press, but also through other means. So I think it's sort of rounding out our ideas about who could have been writing in these literary circles and what their lives might have been like. So yeah, I think what's new in this book that can enrich our understanding of what Jewish culture might have been like in the sort of interwar period. I think it's pretty unusual to have a book that's set in London, where I certainly can't think of any other Yiddish literature that was produced in that area. But of course, Esther Kreitman met with visiting scholars and writers, and she herself traveled.
I'm sure there is. London was also, home to a very large Yiddish speaking immigrant community, particularly in the East End. There was, a large Yiddish press there, and like some very prominent figures from the Yiddish press. I'm thinking particularly of a guy named Morris Rumszewski. But as far as like well-known Yiddish writers coming out of England, out of London, aside from Kreitman, right now I'm drawing a blank, although I'm sure other people perhaps in our audience can fill us in. There definitely were some, and must have been some. So it wasn't really totally Yechupetz in London. And we see that in the memoir, that there is a large and organized Jewish community that provides support for refugees, whatever, however, sufficient or insufficient that might have been. They have a home there, they have a social circle there. It's a big city and a big Jewish community, even, during the First World War.
Do you think we should think of that community as being integrated into British culture, or was it sort of like an island inside the larger world of London?
I don't know that I'm the person to speak of this. I don't have any particular knowledge of, any specialized knowledge of, English Jewry. We have on our staff, David Mazauer, who would, and maybe, we can consult him later. But I don't know to what degree the community there was integrated, more or less integrated in Jewish immigrant and refugee communities elsewhere in the world.
And I would toss in that in our audience, and I think I can name names, is Vivi Lax, who is in London. She wrote Yiddish Town, East End Jewish Life in Yiddish Sketch and Story. And she presents selection of previously, thank you, Ellen Cassidy, as well in our audience, for a synopsis here, previously untranslated short stories and sketches, including Katie Brown, A.M. Kaiser, I.A. Liskey, for the general audience and academics alike. And it really does paint a picture of a very lively area of the East End of London, where there was a sizable community, a Jewish community, and also a sort of struggling political, religious community. So there was literature coming out of there as well. And I think, Max, just to back up, the question of Yiddish work in translation by women writers is something that everybody is working on rediscovering, and certainly Esther Kreitman is somebody who deserves attention. I think this memoir, although in times hard to read, is an interesting way to sort of understand the challenges that Esther faced as a woman in a family that did not want to have their daughter write. There's a brutal story about how her mother threw out her first notebook out a train window to say, no, you shouldn't write. She had two brothers who went on to become very well known, but in her own right, she received acclaim for her writing. And worth noting, Maurice Carr, wants to deal with the fact that his upbringing wasn't easy, and provides, I think, in some ways, and maybe many in our audience would have thoughts about this, either a sympathetic or unsympathetic view of who she was.
I think one of the things that we see in the memoir, which is an interesting sort of biographical insight into Esther Kreitman as well as into her milieu, is that because of the fact that she was overshadowed by her brothers, that she was somewhat estranged from her family, that she was relatively obscure, tends to give the impression that she was somehow, as a Yiddish writer, isolated. She was out in London, not rather than in Warsaw or New York. But I think the picture we get from the memoir is actually quite different. That she seems to, although we don't get really any up close portraits of this because Carr was usually not in the room at the time. But he tells us, I think, at several occasions that what she liked to do, what she preferred to do, is go off and hang out with other Yiddish writers. That she did that while they were visiting Poland, and that she would leave him to his own devices and go hang out with her own crowd, and they were other writers. Just so I think we see that she was quite integrated into a Yiddish literary community.
Yeah, I agree. And I think for me, where the book really started to come alive while I was reading it was when Maurice and Esther go to Sweden, and they have sort of a family reunion that is also a literary gathering in the Alps. And they have this sort of, I think it was in the Alps, and they have this sort of, he has this incredible child's eye view of these Yiddish writers and the way that they act around the Singer family. Of course, the way they act around Esther is not the same as the way they act around Israel Joshua. It's not the same as how they act around Isaac Bashevis, who at that point is still just Yitzhak. So, but what's kind of amazing there is that I think you sort of get to see who Isaac Bashevis Singer was before he found his station as a writer. And you get to see the role that this Jewish literary community played in choosing who their champion was going to be. It was going to be him. And they just sort of took to him. They followed him around and they wanted to hear everything he had to say.
Yeah, I agree. That particular.
Go ahead. Sorry, Ezra.
That particular section is maybe the most interesting from a sort of Yiddish literary historical perspective, because we see the whole family, we see its most famous members, and the portrait that Carr creates is really like fascinating. He's I think it feels I guess I would say, I don't know, fair, like he doesn't sound like he's out to get them, but on the other hand, neither is it particularly flattering. He shows that they were quite intelligent and were received as such, but also that they were kind of a bit weird, if that's an appropriate word. And it's not like a huge amount of affection lost there, even between himself and his uncles.
Can we use eccentric?
Yeah.
I'd like to toss out a question, and maybe I want to send this your way, Ezra. As a writer and an editor and a translator, I find Carr's writing really interesting, the way that this memoir is set up. I mean, it's small vignettes, if I may, or these just short passages where he brings the reader in. He creates a scene, and then he moves on. So it's a different kind of thread in terms of holding together as a memoir, and yet it worked for me as these sketches. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it worked for me too. I mean, I've never attempted to write a memoir. I know, people who do. For people who do, it's quite a process to try to, to dredge up memories that most of us don't, revisit particularly often, and turn them into, enlarge them and to turn them into like a narrative and into literature. Um, it seems like quite a difficult thing. And so Carr has a method of doing it, which is not to be totally not to try to be totally comprehensive, not to write like a 500 page volume about every detail of his life, but to, like you say, provide these snapshots, these vignettes. I don't know, maybe you do, Lisa. I don't know how old he was when he wrote this. Um, um, but it seems like, yeah, he's quite a bit older. I mean, he wasn't a young man. It was quite a bit, it was later in life. So yeah, so trying to bring to life these scenes from his childhood is a difficult literary job. And I think that the method that he chose and the way he did it works quite well.
He did write it later in life. I don't know exactly how old he was at the time, but yeah, it almost read to me as though he was using these little vignettes to try to work things out. His life was complicated. His life was complicated by the fact that he had to be the caregiver for his mother, and he accepted that bargain. And as I say, I think these little passages, he's trying to both remember and work through things in a way. I don't know if he ever resolves that. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are about that, Max.
Yeah, well, I think of his style as being almost like more than being an ancestor of the singers literarily. I think of him as more being derived from Philip Roth. Like he is dredging up these. It seems like he has a direct interest in dredging up the sort of grotesque side of his adolescence, his fantasies and his curiosity about dating and his very difficult relationships with his parents. And to me, some sections almost read like a settling of accounts or an attempt to get at a settling of accounts. Like he wants it to be written down that he went through these things. It feels to me like he wants to feel seen in having had this life where he lived a lot of his early life only being seen by his parents, who saw too much of him. He couldn't get away from them. And he only sort of breaks free when he finally gets a job. And when he gets a job and when he finds his partner, Lola, that is when he sort of begins to write in a way that I think is like truly shows some sort of interest in the world around him. Before that, it's just kind of like this dark struggle is how I see it.
Ezra, I know you you work with book club as well, putting together the questions and some of the resources. Curious to know the kind of questions that you posed and what you were looking for in terms of answers.
I don't know if I recall them all off the top of my head. And I think we're addressing them as we speak. But one thing that comes to mind when you mentioned Carr working things out. We have on our website, and this is one of the resources I point to. We have an oral history interview with his daughter Hazel Carr, who presented this book to us for publication. And I believe one of the things that she says in that interview is that her father wanted to be a writer, like his mother, like his uncles, and he succeeded to a degree. He wrote a novel that's now almost impossible to get a hold of, based on the job that he describes working in that warehouse by the docks. And he translated members of his family, translated Yiddish literature. He wrote this book, but for the most part, he was a journalist, a successful journalist, right? He worked for Reuters in Paris. He wrote for all kinds of publications, but journalism was kind of a thing that he did for money. It was how he had to make a living, right? He had a family, and he had to make a living. So he sacrificed what Hazel says is that basically he sacrificed a lot of his literary ambition in order to, to do work that, he could make a living at. Which is, a little sad. I mean, it is what it is, but you can see there that there's a certain kind of you know sympathy, or he with his mother, that the both of them struggled with with the fulfillment of a literary ambition that was often frustrated or difficult to achieve.
I also watched Hazel Carr's interview with the Yiddish Book Center, which is great that the Yiddish Book Center has these oral histories, because it's like creating an archive of these descendants. And one thing that really struck me in her interview was that her name, she was not born Hazel, she was born Hannah, just like Maurice Carr was not born Maurice Carr. He was born Moishele. And then he upgraded to Morris, or downgraded. And then even Morris Kreitman wasn't good enough. It had to be Maurice Carr. And I was thinking about how to write as a Jew at this time would have probably locked you out of a lot of careers. And he has to change his name in order to keep a job as a foreign correspondent at a newspaper. And so I was thinking about how part of what is being done in this memoir is sort of like tracing the through line of the changing of not just who he is, but also sort of who his name is and who his family is becoming generation by generation. So at the next level, we have Hazel Carr, who again has changed her name to some extent. And I just thought it was interesting to see how this family is sort of like moving towards assimilation in a way over time, with steps going from the old country and then to the East End. And now we have this generation.
And Carr refers to this in a working title, that it's the other exile, how he and his mother were exiled to London and also exiled from a family. So that was an interesting way also to approach this in terms of what he was trying to write about.
There's also an interesting parallel here, of him sort of changing his name, or, taking on a sort of pseudonym in a family that was full of literary pseudonyms. But, as you point out, I think the reasons, behind, say, his changing his name, versus his uncle, Bashevis becoming Bashevis, which was a pseudonym, or any of his other pseudonyms, were very different, and the difference is that Carr was writing in English. And he was working for the mainstream press, and he was attempting to assimilate professionally, if not personally, to make it in the larger world, whereas his uncles and his mother were fully a part of the Yiddish world, and were writing predominantly for Yiddish for Yiddish speaking audiences. So so they never had that kind of motivation, to change their names, for that reason.
I actually hadn't known that Bashevis was a pen name, and it's interesting to see that it came from his mother, Batsheva, who I love that she's fleshed out in this book. And one of the most remarkable moments of the book is when she meets her daughter again after many years and says, "You aren't as ugly as I thought you were." It's one of the most horrible things I could think of to say to your daughter. And it strikes such a note, and it's so interesting, I think, how her portrait sort of like complicates or tells us more about gender norms at the time, and how she, just like Esther, she was also locked into a role she didn't want to be in.
I'm going to read a comment from someone who I know is in the book club, who is an active member in terms of the forum and commenting. At which point I'm going to retract my first statement, which is don't send comments. But I think since there are so many members of the book club, please do send your comments and we can toss them around because you've read the book. But his treatment of his uncles was humorous in a sardonic way, especially of their behavior at the reunion. I agree his writing made his dysfunctional family palatable to the casual reader, demonstrating his own writing outside journalism. Thoughts?
I mean, I'm interested to hear that someone found his writing about his family palatable, because to me, his writing about his family often made me very uncomfortable. It made me uncomfortable to think that somebody would commit these stories that feel very private to such a public forum as a memoir that would be published.
I guess I'd also ask the question, if we take the Singer family out of the equation, how does it work for us as a memoir?
And I think it works completely. The fact that it's about the singers, the people that we know about, makes it more interesting, makes it perhaps more alluring. But if we took them out of the equation entirely, I think it would still be a great book. I mean, I don't think it depends on that for its merit.
Which is why we chose to publish it. Thank you. That's it's true. It's a well-written memoir. It's an interesting read. Yeah.
I think it's true, and I would also say that his writing about other people is some of his most insightful writing. So even if he's not writing about the Singer family, when he's writing about Lola, his wife, and her experiences, you get a very interesting through line about what it was like to live through the early years of World War II and what it would be like to be a new family during that time. It's very interesting.
Okay, here's a tough lob coming over the net. What do you make of the irony of having a book devoted to Esther Kreitman, whose title doesn't name her, but does name her brothers?
Yeah, I do think that's a problem with the title of the book. I also think that if one is gonna go to the trouble of naming Isaac Bashevis Singer, maybe I.J. Singer could get a full naming as well. But I think more to the point, it was a little hard for me to even understand who the book was going to be about just from looking at the title. So you pick it up and you flip it over, then it sort of starts to make sense. But we still don't know who Esther Kreitman is if we just look at the title, and I do think that's a problem.
Another one of the audience says, shouldn't we see these relationships in context of many difficult parent-child relationships? I.L. Peretz also didn't have an easy relationship with his son. I don't know about that, but I mean, isn't this the stuff of memoirs?
I think you could argue that Esther Kreitman never knew what it was like to be raised in a nurturing family. So she was probably doing the best that she could. I mean, she was maybe too nurturing, but parents say you're always either too nurturing or not nurturing enough. So I guess she leaned on the overbearing side, if you want to put it that way. But I think that there's a cycle implied in the book of sort of one layer of emotional trauma begetting another.
Do you ever see you're reading something, an account by a son in a memoir about a mother, someone we know who had a really troubled life, but also persevered and was a good writer on her own. Are we missing some of her inner strength that kept her going?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we are, but we're sort of confined here within Maurice Carr's perspective. And so I think he does portray his mother as a strong person, but it's it's all very much colored by their relationship, which was difficult. So I don't think that his purpose here is to defend his mother particularly, or to portray her from an exclusively sympathetic point of view. It's to to write about, to express that difficulty of that relationship. So we're not seeing it from her perspective, and we're not getting the full, the full measure of her strength or perseverance or any of it. But we have to read her own work, I think, for that. We're getting Carr's point of view.
Yeah, she also parents much better than the father does, who sort of, what does he do? He's not around too much. When he is around, he's not that nice or loving. So, it sort of is like she's the only one who you could say is really paying attention to the family and maintaining their family.
Curious to ask Max, as moderator of as I say, the Facebook group, what's your takeaway of how you read it and how some of the others are reading or reading into it?
It's a good question. Well, we just started it, so I don't really know what other people are thinking yet. Usually what I'm most interested to know is whether people would say they liked the book, because contained in liking the book could be a lot of shades of gray. And I think when I think about whether or not I like this book, I know that when I began reading it, I didn't like it. And by the end, I liked it. And something changed. In the beginning, I felt like we were stuck in the mind of a child. He wrote as a child with child's memories. And there was nothing to really hold on to as an adult to really sink your teeth into and think about. At the end, he is an adult and he's dealing with complex psychological issues and politics and the problem of being an artist. So I like, it does follow sort of like the trajectory of a person's life in that way. So the first half sort of reminds me of this earlier book we read in a previous year called Burning Lights by Bella Chagall, where she wrote a child's memoir that sort of traced the cycle of the Jewish holidays. And it was beautifully illustrated. So that book also, to me, back then reading it, I remember thinking, how do I read a book written about childhood as an adult? And I still don't really know the answer to that. So I was happy when we got to sort of adulthood in the book.
I can't help but then respond to you, if I may, Max, by saying, and I think this is true with a lot of the books we read, and kind of interesting about the book club is you get a range of ages of all of us reading. And I think at certain points in life, we read differently into a book. And so Maurice Carr, writing later in life, reflecting on his life, I think is probably a different experience for somebody in that point in life than somebody who hasn't yet delved into that, if I may. And I think this was certainly true in the conversations that came up with Chava Rosenfarb's short stories a couple of years ago in book club. I found it really interesting. And I wonder how you also deal with that in terms of moderating this book and any others which have that possible challenge.
Yeah, I mean, the essential conflict is how to get people who don't like a book or can't relate to a book to see what might be a value in it. Sometimes I have to talk myself into finding value in a book. I won't name any specific ones that we've read, but once in a while there's one that's really difficult for me to get into, and it's sort of a puzzle to unlock it. So one of the things I really like about moderating the book club is people never like what I think they're going to like, and they never dislike what I think they'll dislike. There's always a lot of opinions in the book club, which I love.
It's also being pointed out that Dina, an autobiographical novel by Ida Maza, also published by White Goat Press and brilliantly translated by Yirmiyahu Aaron Taub, this person is suggesting another example of a book that starts out with a very young child's point of view and then beautifully expands into a more mature perspective. And do we see that in this book or not? I'm not sure.
I think he gets more mature than he starts out, but he also makes sure to always let us know about his immature side, I would say. And I feel that he never misses an opportunity to sort of remind us of sort of the kind of icky side of being a person, these difficult relationships that you have to have, these fights that you have to have. And uh, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say whether it reads maturely.
And I guess it's also apparent that he's thrust into the role of the parent,
Yeah.
not
Yes.
easy. Yeah.
Yeah, something that I was thinking about was sort of from his mother's perspective, you see that she she does not think she is having an easy life. And she says there's been a demon following me around since I was born. And the rest of the family sort of agrees with her. They kind of give it to her. They say she was unlucky and she has this health issue. But I was sort of wondering about, what would it have been like to have grown up with the attitude that you could be, that your mother thinks that she's been doomed. It must have really affected him.
Yeah. Um, Ezra, any other probing questions that you're wanting to toss out there?
Yeah, to be honest, one of the things that sort of this book made me want, I guess, was to know more about Carr as a person. I mean, we get, what we get through the memoir, but it's a literary work, is very, selective, very short. But he just sounds like a very fascinating and interesting person. I would have liked to have known him or have, to be able to I don't think there are any interviews or video interviews with him extant that I know about. It would have, but it would have been, I think, really interesting to see what he was like, just as like a, as a person, as a human being. Um, Going back a little bit to, the conversation about the degree to which he was trying to assimilate, becoming Maurice Carr and so forth. It's interesting to me too that he seemed to have had a foot in both worlds. That one of his major literary endeavors was translating Yiddish. His family's mother and his uncles. That was one of his first literary endeavors. He was very committed to it. I recall having come across his name, in some older translations of Yiddish literature, no, having no idea who he was. And it's a sort of a funny name for like a Yiddish translator, Maurice Carr. Like, who is this guy? But despite becoming Maurice Carr and going off, and becoming a journalist in Paris and so forth, he was very committed to Yiddish and to Yiddish literature. And it would have been interesting to, I think, have to know him a little better and to have a fuller portrait of who he was throughout his life.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges for the three of us, too, is it's hard to without knowing this person, and there's not much written about him, to be able to figure out what his motivation was for writing this, or what some of the things he was hoping would come out in this work, how to discuss those. He's not here to answer, which is very hard. Yeah. Do you find that?
Yeah. So you have the persona that he gives us, but that's a literary persona.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is a question about why wasn't the book published during his lifetime? And from what I understand from Hazel, it just never found its way to an English language publisher that wanted to bring it out, which is, happens to lots of books. It's not unique to this book. But there you go with that one.
One thing that we didn't touch on, I just realized, was the anti-Semitism that he describes growing up with, which it felt to me to be very raw, but I was just curious whether it seemed extreme to you or if it seemed sort of like, was that to be expected for for any Jewish kid growing up at that time.
Doesn't sound like it was an unusual experience. But I wasn't there.
So, I think I'm going to, end this conversation here. There are a lot of members in the book club who are, as you say, Max, just starting into the book. And I think I would want to encourage those of you who are in the audience, who are a part of the book club, to hop on. It's a private Facebook page, and it really gives everybody an opportunity to comment in real time and get responses to your comments in a more conversational way than we can allow for on this Zoom tonight. It's really easy if you are a member of the book club, just write to us at the book club at yiddishbookcenter.org, and we can bring you on to the private page. You don't have to have a Facebook page. You can just work within the confines of this private page. And if you want to learn more about becoming part of the book club, it's free. Just also write to us and we'll send you information, and there's information on our website as well. So I want to thank you both, Max and Ezra, for joining us and beginning the conversation about this book as we begin to venture into it and read through it as a group.
Oh, thank you very much, Lisa.
And send your comments our way after, if you want to revisit any of this from tonight. Thanks. I want to thank this evening's producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli, for her help behind the scenes as always. Tonight's program again is presented as part of the Yiddish Book Center's Great Jewish Books Book Club. You can learn more at yiddishbookcenter.org/book-club. Also, you'll find our full calendar of events, see what's coming up, both in-person events and virtual events. We've got a lot on the calendar in the coming months, including events in New York, Miami, Chicago, and of course here in Amherst, where we just opened our new core exhibition, Yiddish: A Global Culture. Learn more about that on our site, plan a visit, and we are also coming back with tours, public tours, and also screenings and a few author talks. Thanks again to all of our members whose support makes all of our ongoing work possible. Learn more about how you can join and support the work at the Yiddish Book Center at yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Until our next Thursday evening, stay well, stay healthy, and tune in again. Thanks for joining us.